You know those times online when you see some advice and just think, really? Is that a thing?
Huh?
I was on this discussion forum recently, people talking about getting through really tough stuff, trauma, and honestly, the suggestion that kept coming up, play Tetris.
Tetris, the block game.
Yeah, the classic falling blocks game. And it made me stop and wonder, is there actually anything to that? It sounds so random.
That's a brilliant question, actually. And yeah, it leads us straight into some pretty fascinating research. So today, it's exactly what we're diving into. Can Tetris actually be a tool after trauma?
Okay.
We'll look at some of those online chats, but mostly the scientific studies trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
The mission is really to see if there's science behind it,
Yeah.
and maybe more importantly, what the limits are.
Right. Okay. Let's unpack this because honestly, my first reaction was just disbelief mixed with a lot of curiosity. A video game having that kind of effect.
It seems surprising.
Yeah. And our initial look suggests, well, maybe a partial yes. And this phrase kept coming up. Cognitive vaccine for traumatic memories. It sounds almost sci-fi.
It does sound dramatic, cognitive vaccine. But the idea behind it, it's actually rooted in how our brains work.
Yeah.
Specifically, how we process and store memories.
Yeah.
Especially visual ones.
Okay.
So to really get a handle on it, let's quickly define our terms, make sure we're all clear on Tetris itself and what we mean by PTSD.
Good idea.
Yeah.
So Tetris, most people probably know it, right? It's ancient in-game terms back to 1985.
Oh, yeah.
Simple concept. These different shaped blocks fall down. You rotate them, move them, try to make solid lines across the screen. Then poof, the line disappears.
Right.
It's very visual, very spatial, needs you to think fast about shapes and spaces.
Right.
And it can be weirdly absorbing, You just focus on those blocks.
Exactly. And that core gameplay, manipulating visual shapes in space,
Yeah.
that's actually key to the whole theory we're going to talk about. Now, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's really important to say not everyone who goes through something traumatic develops PTSD. Many people do experience trauma.
Right. It's not automatic.
No. But for those who do develop it, it's this cluster of symptoms that stick around. They're distressing, they follow a traumatic event, or maybe even a series of them.
And those symptoms sound like they can just take over your life. Things like reliving the event, flashbacks, nightmares, feeling like the world's just dangerous all the time, being constantly jumpy, hypervigilance, is that the term?
That's right, hypervigilance. And just this sort of pervasive fear, it sounds exhausting. And the sources mentioned the brain almost gets like hypersensitive to future threats too.
Exactly. It's deeply tied to how the brain encodes, stores, and then retrieves those traumatic memories. Which brings us right back to Tetris and this cognitive vaccine idea.
Which came out of Oxford University, was it? Back in 2009?
Yes, 2009. That's when the initial research was published.
Okay, so tell me about this theory. What's the core idea?
Well, the fascinating bit is this understanding that our brains, they only have so much bandwidth, right? Limited capacity for processing stuff, especially visual information, visual memories.
Like a computer with limited RAM?
Sort of, yeah. And the theory goes, if you do something really visually demanding, like playing Tetris right after a traumatic event, you could basically overload those visual processing circuits in the brain. It's like trying to push too much data through the same pipe at once.
Ah, okay. So you're basically hogging the brain's visual resources.
That's the idea.
So the traumatic visual memories, the images, they can't get properly solidified because Tetris is using up that space.
Exactly. You're competing for the same mental real estate that the brain would normally use to lock in those really vivid, horrible visual flashbacks. The intrusions, they call them.
Intrusions?
Right. So playing Tetris acts like a kind of mental traffic jam, specifically for those traumatic images, makes them maybe less intense, less frequent later on. That's the cognitive vaccine idea, targeting the visual stuff.
A mental traffic jam. I like that analogy. It makes sense. And that first study, the 2009 one you mentioned, it seemed to show this worked, in the lab at least.
Yeah, that's what our sources describe. They had people watch films, traumatic films, in a controlled setting.
Okay.
Then right after, one group played Tetris for just like 10 minutes. The other group just sat quietly, I think.
And the results?
Pretty striking, apparently. The Tetris group reported significantly fewer intrusive memories of those films afterwards compared to the group that didn't play.
Wow. Okay. So that's definitely suggestive. A simple visual game might interfere with forming those vivid trauma memories.
But like you said, in the lab.
Right. Big difference between watching a film and experiencing, actual real-world trauma.
Totally. So what happened next? Did researchers try this with people who'd gone through actual traumatic events? Did it still work?
That is the absolutely crucial question. And yeah, things get really interesting here. Since that first study, there have been quite a few clinical studies, especially, say, since 2017 or so. A recent literature review pulled these together. Now, a lot of these studies, we should say, were fairly small, not huge numbers of people.
Right, that's common in early research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the results have generally been positive across different types of trauma, too.
Like what kinds of situations did they look at?
Let's see. Studies included women after a traumatic childbirth, people involved in car accidents,
Okay.
also war refugees, and even some studies with war veterans. So quite a diverse range of real-life difficult experiences.
And across these different groups, playing Tetris seemed to help.
It was associated with fewer intrusive memories, fewer flashbacks related to their specific trauma. So it does look like the effect might carry over from the lab to real-world survivors.
That's actually quite hopeful.
It is, though, again, small studies. And there's a catch we need to discuss later about guidance.
Okay. But first, what about the timing and the dose, so to speak? How much Tetris and how soon after the event?
Good question. Typically in these studies, people played for somewhere between 10 and maybe 40 minutes.
Not a huge amount of time.
No. And usually they did this within roughly 30 to 72 hours after the event happened. So quite soon afterwards.
Within the first few days.
Exactly. But what's also really intriguing, some newer research hints it might even help later on, years later.
How would that work?
Well, one study looked at childbirth trauma up to 7 years after the fact.
Yeah.
The idea was to first briefly bring the specific intrusive visual memory to mind.
Okay, reactivate it.
Yeah, reactivate it consciously for a moment,
Yeah.
and then play Tetris for about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And that also seemed to reduce how often those intrusions happened and how upsetting they were.
Wow. That's really interesting. Reactivating the memory, then sort of scrambling it with Tetris, like editing the memory file.
It's a fascinating possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, we absolutely have to talk about the caveats here, the limitations.
Definitely. Sounds promising, but need to keep our feet on the ground.
Precisely. First off, we just need more research. Bigger studies, more diverse groups, to really nail down if these effects are solid, especially out there in the messy real world.
Makes total sense. Small studies point the way, but you need the big ones for confirmation. What else?
Another really important point. Those earlier studies, the ones showing good results, often the participants weren't just playing Tetris on their own. They had some professional guidance or instruction alongside it.
Ah. So it wasn't just, here's a phone, play Tetris.
Not always, no.
Yeah.
And we don't really know yet how well it works if someone just, downloads the app and plays by themselves right after something awful happens. Does it have the same effect without that support? Still an open question.
That's a crucial detail. And what about other games? Does it have to be Tetris? What if you play, I don't know, Candy Crush or a word game?
Good point. Our sources mentioned one study that actually compared Tetris to word games and also to a control group doing nothing.
And what did they find?
Interestingly, both gaming groups, Tetris and the word game group, reported fewer intrusions than the no-game group.
Huh. So maybe any absorbing game helps.
It suggests that maybe any task that really occupies your mind, that creates what scientists call cognitive interference, might help disrupt that memory consolidation process, basically keeping the brain busy.
Okay.
But the thinking is that Tetris, being so intensely visual and spatial, might be particularly good at targeting those visual intrusions, which are often a big part of PTSD flashbacks. Word games might hit different aspects, maybe more verbal memory stuff.
Right. Matching the tool to the specific problem visual game for visual memories. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together for you, the listener. What are the practical takeaways here? What can we actually say based on the evidence?
Okay, so based on what we know now, which is still limited, remember, and keeping in mind that professional guidance was often involved initially.
Right.
Playing Tetris, or maybe another game that really grabs your visual attention, for about 20 minutes in those first few hours or days after a traumatic event might help reduce how many intrusive visual memories you have later on.
Okay. Might help with the visual flashbacks.
Potentially. And also, that other idea, briefly recalling a specific bad visual memory from the past and then playing Tetris right after, might also lessen how often it pops up and how much it distresses you.
And I feel like this is the really important part. This isn't a magic bullet, is it? It's not a cure.
Absolutely not. Cannot stress this enough. Tetris is not a cure for trauma or PTSD.
Okay.
Those intrusive memories, they might become less frequent, less intense maybe, but they might not go away completely. And PTSD is way more complex than just visual flashback.
Right. There's the anxiety, the avoidance, the feeling unsafe, all that other stuff.
Exactly. Changes in mood, how you see the world, being easily startled. Tetris isn't likely to touch those broader symptoms in a big way.
So it could be maybe one small tool for one specific symptom,
Potentially, yes.
but it absolutely doesn't replace getting proper professional help if you're struggling.
100%. The strong advice from all the sources is, if you are experiencing symptoms that feel like PTSD, you really need to seek help from a doctor, a therapist, a qualified professional.
Yeah.
Tetris, if it's used at all, might be something that's included as part of a bigger treatment plan, guided by that professional. But it's definitely not a substitute for therapy or other proven treatments.
Okay, that's super important to land on. So, summing up, Tetris shows some, potential promise maybe as a tool for managing those really upsetting visual memories after trauma.
Right, specifically visual intrusions.
But it's not a standalone fix. We need more research, and professional guidance seems key.
That's a fair summary of where things stand, which kind of leads to a final thought maybe for you listening.
Yeah.
What other things that we do every day really hook into that visual spatial processing part of our brain? Like Tetris does, could this whole idea of cognitive interference, using one task to disrupt another mental process, apply elsewhere for other kinds of mental well-being challenges?
That's a great question. Like, could engaging brain games, or maybe even something like, I don't know, detailed drawing or complex puzzles, could they potentially disrupt things like constant worrying or going over and over negative thoughts?
It makes you think, doesn't it, about how we might consciously use focus as a tool.
Yeah. It's fascinating how game and mental health are intersecting now, and the idea that a simple puzzle game, Tetris, might offer even a small bit of help after trauma. It just shows how much more we have to learn about how our brains cope, process, and maybe even heal from really tough experiences.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing quest, really, to find new ways to support mental health and recovery.